Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Let's Eat. Today, we're going to be talking about functional testing once again. Last functional testing episode, I went over my results for the first two tests, I believe. So now I'm going to go over my results for the other two tests that I got results for and explain a little bit about what they mean and how they interrelate with the other two tests. That's really where the value comes from. Obviously, each individual test provides us with valuable information. However, it is the culmination of the results and looking at them interrelatedly that allows us to then better understand you and your needs and where the dysfunction lies. Because one single test result, while it can provide value, if we're not understanding the influences of other areas of the body, then do we really understand that result in isolation unless we're looking at the bigger picture? And so that's a big part of the reason why all of the foundational labs through FDN are what's recommended. And I'm certain I'm going to get the question probably multiple times, like, oh, do I have to run all these labs? Because I get it. Obviously, there's a financial investment involved, and it's a process and it's a lot sometimes to have to commit to so much. But my primary argument there will be, well, in order for us to really get the full picture, we do recommend doing all these labs. And that's essentially the FDN philosophy, is being sure that we're looking at the hormone piece, the digestive piece, the microbiome, the liver, oxidative stress, inflammation, immune markers, and all of that, so that we can really put this picture together of your specific body so that we can then proceed most effectively. So let's set the scene for just a moment. You might hear some ruckus in the background, and that is Tally. We are attempting at recording this episode without having to put her in the crate. I really want to avoid having to put her in the crate if I have to. She's good in the crate, but I just like to know that she's able to be out here and running around and playing. But she also is a maniac. And I had her licking a spoon of, I think it was yogurt yesterday, and now she's kind of just been playing with it. So she might be tossing that across the floor, and you'll hear that in the background. But all good noises and fun noises. She got to experience the beach last night. I brought her down the shore to go on the beach for the first time, and it was a lot of fun. She was very afraid of the water, but she was having a lot of fun just digging in the sand. So we love that for her. One day we'll get her in the water, but we'll take some baby steps first. It is also a beautiful morning. I feel as though cool, sunny mornings brings me back to like the mornings before school in like September or October. And they're just so vivid for me. So obviously I know it's June, so it's not the fall. But these types of mornings where it's like a little breezy and it's sunny and it's cool, I have my sliding glass door open, they are just so reminiscent of, or like nostalgic for me. I don't know why, and I love them. I wish it was a couple degrees warmer, but it feels like a cool fall morning, and there's simply nothing I love more. So I'm thriving in this weather, even though I did get limited sleep last night. I went to bed closer to midnight, which is, you know me at all. You know that is way past my bedtime. So we are here with a matcha, and I have my electrolytes, and we're ready to rock. Welcome to Let's Eat. I'm your host, Emily, certified holistic health coach, functional nutrition expert, and self-proclaimed wellness enthusiast, here to meet you at the intersection of physical and mental health, the space within which we become well. This podcast is meant to explore all areas of mind and body wellness, designed to offer you the integrative knowledge, behavioral strategies, and mindset shifts necessary to uplevel your health and feel better today. We'll explore nutrition, sleep, movement, self-care and stress management, habits and routines, self-development, gut health, mental health, and more. I'm so happy that you're here. Welcome to the table. Let's eat. So the first test we're going to talk about is the mucosal barrier assessment. Now, this one is critical for understanding your gut health. I'm going to break it down real basically so you can understand, okay, what in the world is a mucosal barrier? Why is it important? And why should I care about it? Okay. So our mucosal barrier is essentially our gut lining. And we have tons, let me back up a little. We have tons and tons and tons of mucosal barriers across the body. And this is essentially how the outside world meets the inside world. So we have mucosal barriers in our mouths, in our noses, in our ears. I mean, any surface that has contact with the outside world is considered the mucosal barrier. And it's essentially our body's way of determining what can come in and what will go out. Now, this is essential to understand that, there are mucosal barriers across the body. But for the sake of this assessment, we're looking at the mucosal barrier that is in our small intestine, otherwise known as our gut lining, or you might know a problematic mucosal barrier as leaky gut, which I'll explain how we look at that. But this is what we want to really focus on. And this particular mucosal barrier has a couple of roles, including nutrient assimilation and absorption. So this is where our nutrition is drawn into the body and then essentially shuttled into the bloodstream so that it can go to the organs that need nutrition, which, newsflash, our whole body needs nutrition, right? Our whole body needs these nutrients. And then, you can think about it too. Okay, well, if there's problems with this mucosal barrier, what does that say about our nutrition? What does that say about our body's ability to utilize our nutrition? And that is, I think, something that we don't realize is you aren't what you eat, you are what you absorb. And I want you to remember that as you move along, because this is something I think people come across where they think, oh, well, I'm eating so well and I can't seem to feel better. I can't seem to lose weight. Fill in the blank. And it's not to say that it's always an absorption issue, but I think this is a lot more common than we recognize. And not to mention that it also can be an issue of, am I able to break down protein properly? Which in my last test results, I learned I'm not breaking down protein properly. And this is something I need to work on. This is something that needs to be addressed, because obviously if I'm eating enough protein and I'm not utilizing it, then what's the point? I'm trying to think of a good analogy for it. It's kind of like, buying new clothes and then, is that a good one? Buying new clothes and then not wearing them? I don't think that. Yeah, I guess that, I don't know. I'll have to think about it. I'll have to think about what analogy would make sense here. But essentially I learned that my protein's coming in, and for whatever reason, there are issues with my ability to break it down. And that's going to manifest in so many different things, including the integrity of our gut lining, including mood, which I think is so powerful, that protein's broken down into amino acids, and then amino acids are utilized to create neurotransmitters, and neurotransmitters like serotonin, dopamine, all of those have, influence on our mood. Serotonin's our happy chemical. So you can imagine if there's issues with production of our happy chemical, we probably will not be so happy. So something to keep in mind. But as far as this goes, I want you to remember that concept. You aren't what you eat, you are what you absorb. So any potential compromise in this arena speaks to that statement, speaks to that phrase. And so this is where functional testing really comes in to shine, because you're not going to look at this at your GI doctor and look at, these specific markers to understand, is my body absorbing the nutrition? And that's a problem. Now, this is potentially going to manifest in a number of different ways. Digestive issues, I think, are probably among the most common problems that I hear of. Those, they fall into that kind of subclinical category of symptoms that look like bloating, acid reflux, indigestion, constipation, diarrhea, and we've kind of written them off, like even just general discomfort after eating, or abdominal cramping, or feeling prematurely full, or whatever it is, all of these symptoms that I know for me, I've experienced in my 30 years of life, where we've kind of just accepted them as being normal, or we just go get, Tums or Pepsid or whatever we need in order to mitigate that discomfort. But we know that there's actually potential for this underlying discomfort to be, or I'm sorry, underlying dysfunction to be taking place. And this speaks to the quality of our digestion, and I don't want to, generalize it and say it's all about the mucosal barrier or it's all about this or all, because usually it's like a multitude of different things, like a kind of a myriad of different influences that can be taking place there. But this is an excellent test to better understand that. I'm not sure where I was going with that. I think I just lost my train of thought around it. But needless to say, this is going to bring so much value to your health, not just if you have digestive complaints, but also as it relates to how the gut influences every other aspect of our health. And if our gut lining is compromised, then we have inflammation typically present. I mean, there's so many things that we can learn from this. So we'll talk about the anatomy first. We'll talk about the mucosal barrier anatomy briefly so that you can understand what's going on here. And then I'll get into the markers. So, as I mentioned, we know that the mucosal barrier in the small intestine facilitates nutrient absorption. This is through digestion, and then also monitors any foreign invader, we'll call it, making their way into general circulation. So, it is essential for both, like I said, digestion and immunity, and it determines what can come in and what should go out. Now, there's a couple different ways this process takes place, but overall, as I said, the mucosal barrier is the outside world meeting the inside of the body. Now, through this one space, I'll call it the lumen, I won't get too sciencey on you here. If we do decide that testing is something that you want to pursue, I'll go into greater detail about it because I want to be sure you understand what's going on. I also have a visual that you can look at, but the lumen essentially is where everything passes through. And what happens here is there is something called a epithelial layer of cells. And if there's damage here with these cells, we'll say, there can be disruptions in our ability to absorb nutrition, in determining what can come through and what should stay out. All right. If we're, opening doors to relinquish things that we don't want, we'll say toxins or pathogens of any kind, and the doors between the barrier of, we'll say, the lumen, which is where everything is passing through like a river, and then these doors are opening to release these toxins and pathogens and undigested food particles and so forth, will come through, and that's where we see problems. Okay, so it's just essentially this barrier that becomes compromised, and with the influx of foreign invaders, we'll say, and like I said, that can look like a number of different things. That's when those doors remain open, that barrier remains open, and things can come and go. And that's where we see a heightened immune response essentially take place. Because in the most basic way, we want those doors to open when something comes through that shouldn't enter the bloodstream, and we want that defense mechanism to take place so that it can be excreted from the body. But what happens is it becomes a chronic response, whereas an acute response is, okay, the door's open, something is removed, it is excreted out of the body, whether it's through our urine or our feces, and then from there we're back. That border is back intact. It's doing what it needs to do. It's functioning properly. It's keeping watch over what is coming through and what needs to be removed. And there isn't this chronic response that's taking place. So I hope you're following. I was going to go into more like specific depth, but this seems a little bit easier so I can get to the point and get to the markers. So we want this to be a healthy response, but in the way of the modern world, those doors, or we'll call them tight junctions, are being opened more than they should be. We're having many fires break out here, and fire trucks are coming to the rescue all across this barrier and opening up these doors in order for the fire trucks to come through. And we can't discriminate necessarily about what's good and what's not good. And so now we're having this chronic response and things are seeping into the bloodstream and the body is overactive in defending it and addressing it. And that's what we call leaky gut. Okay. So we'll go into this in detail. I also have a graphic for when and if you decide to move forward together, but I just want to put it basically, that's essentially what's happening here. It's an acute response that we need, and it's healthy and it's important, and it, saves our lives essentially. However, when it becomes chronic, that's where the issues start to present themselves. So the first marker that we look at is zonulin. Now, zonulin is measured through our blood. We look at that as a way to understand if leaky gut is present. And this is what controls the opening of those tight junction pathways. Okay, so this is essentially the mechanism that's needed to take out the trash. This is what we say, this is not supposed to be here. So zonulin is called upon to open those tight junctions. And from there, the trash can then be removed from the body, and then the tight junctions close and we're on our way. But when it comes to zonulin, what's happening here is I want you to imagine zonulin as being essentially these fire trucks. And each fire truck in the community is not intending on going to multiple fires, right? Each fire truck is going to go to one fire, then that next fire truck is going to go to the other fire that's in the other town, and then another fire truck is going to go to another, fire in the community. And while these tight junctions are only open for, say, 15 to 30 minutes, right? They only open for the sake of the fact that it's being called upon to relinquish something into this lumen area so that it can be flushed out of the body. When there is elevated zonulin, and we measure this through our blood, when there's elevated zonulin, we know that there are too many fire trucks being called. And that's essentially indicative of the fact that there's so many tight junctions open, right? Because zonulin is being called upon to open these junctions. And there's so many fire trucks coming in to fight these fires that means leaky gut is present. So it's not so much that these tight junctions are staying open and remaining open and they're perpetually open. It's just the fact that there are so many of these tight junctions being opened, right? That zonulin is elevated, that this is where we can understand, okay, there is too much permeability taking place, and that's where a lot of problems can arise. So to put it simply, the more zonulin there is, the more fires there are. And obviously we don't want fires, but it is almost to be expected that there are issues in this department to some extent because of the fact that we are inundated with issues and foreign invaders, we'll call it, that our body is just not used to handling. You think about what individuals were exposed to many years ago. There was just such a different landscape. And now our bodies, even if we have good intentions and even if we're eating well, it's hard to avoid. It's hard to avoid, like the toxins in our food or the antibiotics in the water that we're drinking, or, just being exposed to toxins in the air, the products we're using, the list goes on. So what I learned from my test results is my zonulin is borderline high. So it was on the higher, more hot, like we'll say there's green, there's yellow, and then there's red. I was in like the higher green into yellow. So I'm not totally surprised by it. I think to some extent I knew that there was going to be presence of it. I'm sure if you looked at this test result 10 years ago, 5 years ago, it would look entirely different because I've obviously worked very hard to address my gut and all the damage that I did to it for many years. But this essentially reflects that there is, in fact, a little bit of leaky gut intestinal permeability going on. So now the priority is to address that and reinforce that and, work towards lowering that number so that there's not so many fires that are there, and, better understanding how this plays a role in in the inflammatory response. I mean, we know all disease begins in the gut. Some people don't believe in that statement, but I like to share that because I think that does help us better understand how important and how valuable the gut is. So protocol, looks like reinforcing the gut barrier. So this can come through amino acids. This can come through certain supplements like L-glutamine, slippery elm, marshmallow root, aloe vera, and working on healing that mucosal barrier so that it can do its job. Now, an important consideration to be made is, and I probably already said this, whether it was this episode or the last episode, but really placing the emphasis on looking at all of these markers, not just hooking ourselves onto zonulin and then making up all these theories about, okay, it's elevated or it's not elevated or whatever the case might be, and then using that as our guide. We want to look at each and every marker in light of the others. So when it comes to zonulin, we also want to understand the microbiome, which we will look at in the GI map. I'll speak on that later. But we also want to understand that specific marker, say zonulin, in comparison to the other issues that we see across the body. And then we also want to look at this in light of the client's lifestyle at present, and then also his or her history, because obviously we want to address what could potentially be driving up these issues. And this is not just for zonulin, but this is across the board. We're looking at diet, we're looking at stress management, we're looking at, history, medical history, we're looking at medication use, we're looking at each and every factor that is going to have an influence on this, and also are areas that we can address through their 90-day protocol. The 90-day protocol is mostly just the supplementation, but then we're looking at the other factors of lifestyle that someone can change as soon as today, maybe some easier than others, but can change as soon as today that will have a dramatic impact on these markers. So next we're going to talk about histamine, and histamine, and then we'll also cue in DAO. Histamine is a powerful marker of inflammation in response to permeability changes in the gut. So I mentioned in the last episode that there are a lot of checks and balance systems within the body, and this is another one of those. Histamine is pro-inflammatory, so in excess, that can be problematic. And we need DAO, which is an enzyme, to counterbalance, to break down that histamine to reduce the inflammation. So we don't want too much histamine. We need enough DAO. That ratio, that balance is super important. So histamine is a naturally occurring chemical. You might have heard, oh, I'm on a low histamine diet, or I'm, avoiding high histamine foods. And it's primarily released by mast cells in response to injury, in response to stress. And when there is leaky gut, histamine is what surrounds whatever has entered the lamina propria, which I don't think I mentioned what that is, but essentially it's the last stop before the I almost said item. That's definitely not the right word. Before the pathogen, toxin, undigested food, whatever the case is, enters the bloodstream. And so histamine actually also signals the body to open the tight junctions in the gut lining. So what we just learned is zonulin is what is produced to open the junctions to allow more substances to come into the lamina propria, and this influx increases immune activity. So if there's something suspicious that's coming into the lamina propria, histamine then signals to the body to release zonulin, and we see these tight junctions open, right? So that whatever it is that's coming to the LP, we'll call it for short, can be then removed and returned to the lumen and be flushed out of the body. I hope you're following here. But then once these tight junctions are open, it's a two-way street. So something's being released, things are coming in, that's signaling then to histamine or that signals histamine as an inflammatory response to address this foreign invader. Then that's when zonulin jumps into action to open these tight junctions, and we see how this is kind of like a vicious vicious self-amplifying cycle of permeability and inflammation. So, bottom line is having high histamine can be reflective of inflammation in the gut. And what we know is elevated histamine is often seen alongside zonulin because of that cycle that I just mentioned. So, what we need in response to this high histamine is also enough DAO. Now, diamine oxidase is the name of the enzyme that I'm referring to, and it's essentially the histamine cleanup crew. So, this is that checks and balance system, and this enzyme is made in the valleys between the villi, which I explained the anatomy, but I don't know how in depth I went. The villi is essentially the surface area of the mucosal barrier that is responsible for absorbing the nutrition. And within the valleys of these villi, I want you to imagine your fingers, and it's the area, the space between your fingers that attach to your hands. And so that is where DAO is produced. Now, if there's any damage there, something called a blunted brush border, if there's any damage there because of the impact that toxins and stress and pathogens and so forth have had on this barrier, there might not be the capability of this function to produce DAO. So then that can result in limited DAO, which means elevated histamine, and issues can arise. So having low DAO can be a result of gut inflammation, leaky gut, enzyme production suppression due to stress or pathogens. And as I mentioned, it can indicate damage to the mucosal barrier, because if we have high levels of histamine, you would then expect there to be higher levels of DAO, right? There's a supply and demand that's taking place. But when the body's not supplying the DAO that we want to be seeing, it's likely because something is hindering it, right? And this is something important to consider, because then if we have an elevated level of histamine, that means an elevated level of inflammation. So I hope that you're following me here. Ultimately, we're looking at what's going on. Is there leaky gut? Is there inflammation? The case study that we did for 2 of my exams was following or working with a man who was dealing with IBS, and this is years and years of digestive distress and a host of digestive dysfunction, and not to mention that, but also symptoms that can manifest from having digestive dysfunction. So it's not only just the typical, cramping or constipation or IBS, which IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, is really just a collection of symptoms. Syndrome is a collection of symptoms. Oh, good Lord. A syndrome is a collection of symptoms. So it's kind of, in my personal opinion, kind of a BS diagnosis that doctors give people because they don't know what else to give them. But I believe that IBS is truly this, is exactly what I'm explaining here, but doctors are not going to be looking at these markers, and that's unfortunate. So I think IBS really is leaky gut, intestinal inflammation, and we're just not really good at detecting that. We're just given medication or told to remove dairy or whatever the case is. But I digress. I'm gonna move right along, because I have plenty of things to say. But when we look at these 2 markers, we also want to look at them in relation to each other. That's where the DAO and histamine ratio comes into play. And so I want you to imagine that histamine is the fire and DAO is the water. And we want to determine, is there enough water to put out the fire? And in a lot of cases, this is not the case. So we want to see if there's a balance there. And, this will help us determine, is the relationship there balanced or is it imbalanced? And in my case, it was a little bit on the more imbalanced side. My histamine was high. My DAO was kind of in the middle. And so the histamine to DAO ratio was a little bit elevated. So now going to work on lowering the levels of histamine. looking at all of the other factors that may be influencing this elevation, and then calling into question, okay, why is my DAO not meeting the need? Or breaking down histamine. Why is there an elevation there? And this could largely be due to the fact that there is dysfunction in my mucosal barrier, right? We're learning this from the zonulin, the borderline elevated zonulin that's there. And we can also look at this through our GI map, which is going to look at the microbiome, and then also through stress and having chronic stress. And I learned that I do have elevated cortisol. So we're looking at my body through the catabolic state, which means it's being broken down and it's not being built up the way that we want it to be. And we want a healthy balance between the catabolism and the anabolism, and that is identified through cortisol, the DHEA. So you see how all these pictures kind of overlap and how we can start to make connections between what's going on with my hormones, and then, how is the gut and the liver, playing a role here, and what does everything say about my digestion, because there's a ton of markers that reflect digestion. You get the drill. So the next test that we're going to be talking about is the GI map, which I think is probably one of the more common tests that people know. And I think it's because gastroenterologists will run this test. Now, the difference between what I will do as an FDM and what a doctor will do with these results is the doctor will use it diagnostically. So a doctor will diagnose with this tool. As an FDN, instead of taking individual results and using that diagnostically, we will use it as looking at the terrain of your microbiome. And that is the difference. It's not in our practice. We're not licensed physicians to be able to diagnose, first and foremost. But even if we could, I would say that it goes against the philosophy of really looking at this image from a greater view, as opposed to looking at each individual bacteria and understanding them, in their isolated way, and instead looking at it at a wider angle. And so this goes for the bacteria, this goes for pathogens, this goes for fungi and yeast, this goes for anything. It's more important that we're seeing it as part of the terrain of the microbiome. It is the result of the problem. It is not the problem. Okay, so the presence of H. pylori or the presence of candida or whatever the case is not the problem itself. It is the result of the problem. There's something that went on here that allowed for these overgrowths, for these pathogens to become present. And that is the key, one of the key differences between the way we see these lab results versus the way a healthcare provider would see it. So, like I said, the GI map could quite literally be its own episode. So, I'm going to run through this and I'm going to share a little bit about my results. But bottom line is, if you can get your hands on a GI map, I think it could be life changing for you in a number of ways, just because we know how valuable our microbiome is in relation to our whole body health and mental health included. I will advocate for this for the rest of my life, that we should all be getting GI maps. I think we should be routinely getting GI maps. And I say that only because I know it's unrealistic to expect everyone to also get access to these other tests. But a GI map is powerful. Now, once again, through the FDN philosophy, we look at the GI map in light of the other tests. Whereas a GI doctor, maybe even a primary care doctor, I don't know, but probably just a GI medicine, will look at it on its own as a standalone. And I even have a girlfriend one of my best friends, who she may be listening, and she has been doing GI maps for like 2 years now, just as check-ins over the course of her protocols that she's been following for different GI related, issues, overgrowths, H. pylori, etc. And I said to her, you know, I understand the value of it, but I also think you're missing some of these other tests that can really complement the GI map and see it maybe through a different lens, as opposed to just running it alone, saying, okay, it's working or it's not working, keep doing this, let's add this, stop doing this, and so forth, but then keep not seeing the results that we want. There's something missing here, and it's not to the fault of the doctor. Okay, let me just say that, because her doctor happens to be my doctor, and I love our doctor very much, but she is integrative, but she doesn't go the extra mile with some of these other tests. And a lot of, just the fact that she's running it alone, I think says a lot about her practice and what she believes in. So I'm happy for that. But there just needs to be more. So I'm excited to offer her tests supplemental to the GI map, just because I think we'll learn a lot more about the whole body if we're looking at it with all these other factors involved. But forgive me, I will get back on track now. Okay, so the first page is looking at bacterial pathogens, parasitic pathogens, viral pathogens. As FDNs, this is outside of our scope of practice. So if anything was detected here, we would refer you to go see a doctor. So this is things like C. diff and E. coli, things of that capacity. That is far beyond what our scope looks like. So this would be something you'd want to seek out a doctor for. Then we move into the next page. I'm going this section by section, but typically we kind of dance around a little bit, so it won't be as linear as the report reflects. But for the sake of today's conversation, we are going about it this way. So next is H. pylori. And for those of you who don't know, this is actually very common. I just read the other day that 50% of the population has, or it's suspected that 50% of the population has H. pylori. It is also highly contagious, and it can cause issues, but it can also not cause issues, which I think makes it very hard to detect without testing, because it's not like an outward necessarily like experience that you're having like you do a stomach bug, which this is quite literally a stomach bug, but it can cause a lot of harm. Okay, and like I said, it's very contagious. So I had a client who was getting functional testing from a practitioner that I collaborated with, and she was told by this practitioner, you should really consider getting your husband tested, getting your kids tested, because if they end up testing positive, she does this protocol, she kisses her husband or shares a spoon with her kid, then she's more at risk for catching it again and starting back at square one. So to explain a little bit about what this is Helicobacter pylori, H. pylori for short. It is a spiral-shaped bacteria that resides in the stomach, and it can burrow into the stomach lining. It's extremely common, as I said, and what it does is it neutralizes surrounding stomach acid to survive, which impairs digestion. So it's really interesting, because what we know about this is if the H. pylori is neutralizing the stomach acid and certain enzyme production relies on strong stomach acid to be produced, what does that say about the enzyme production? It is likely going to be compromised, because if the H. pylori is neutralizing the surrounding stomach acid, and the pancreas will say relies on that stomach acid to release these protein, fat enzymes for digestion, then what do we think is going to happen to our digestion? It's going to be impaired. Now, what's interesting too, as an aside, excuse me, if you are taking an HCl supplement, right, hydrochloric acid, this can also make matters worse, because H. pylori, as a result of that supplementation, which some people take to help support digestion, which it can be very effective. I'll just put that out there. It can be very effective. But if you have H. pylori, this can actually cause H. pylori to burrow farther into the stomach lining and create more of a destructive impact. So something to consider. The case study that I was doing for my practicals, he reported trying HCl in the past and making matters worse for him. And he said, it didn't work for me. I didn't feel well. He had some symptoms around it. And then come to find out, his GI map reflected that he had that he had H. pylori. So it's interesting, right? Because you can make that connection there. And that may even be a question that I can ask. Not to say I'm going to assume, oh, you must have H. pylori if you have an adverse reaction to the HCl. However, still something to consider, right? Like to kind of keep that in mind so that we do look at the results, we can make kind of some connections there. So H. pylori can also be more harmful through something called a virulence factor, and this enhances its ability to persist and damage the stomach lining. So if you look at a GI map, you'll see H. pylori, and then you'll see the result and the reference range. And then if a virulence factor is listed there, this is going to maybe intensify the need for someone to treat the H. pylori. Now, some say that H. pylori may offer some protection for the body, and we can look at it as maybe something positive. Having a little bit of stress in our lives is actually very helpful for us. So, some choose not to self-treat. There's kind of mixed research there. Some, think that, we should be completely eradicating it. Some research, says that it's okay to not treat it. But in this case, I do have a positive virulence factor, so it's going to be treated. I'm working on getting the supplements for it and going about it through the holistic route, of course. And so that's the first kind of group that we look at. Then we look at our commensal or keystone bacteria, and we look at these good bacteria as being a community. And what we want is a healthy balance of all of these individuals, we'll say, of the community. I learned from one of the FDNs, and she refers to them as being kind of like the chief of police, the fire chief, the principal of the local, elementary school, I don't know, like the sheriff, right? All of these individuals in a community that you'd want to be there in order to feel safe. So we want these in a healthy balance. These are what we considered our good bacteria. And we also want them in balance with our bad bacteria, which I'll get into. But we have a symbiotic relationship with these good bacteria. And if we give them food that they want, which, spoiler alert, most people are not giving them the food that they want, they'll do what we want them to do for us. And that is to support healthy digestion. They extract nutrients and energy from food. They maintain a healthy gut barrier. They produce certain vitamins. They protect against harmful pathogens. So we don't want them happy. We want them flourishing, but we also don't want them too elevated. We don't want them imbalanced in any way. And so this is another one of those, not too high, not too low. Just because they're good bacteria doesn't mean we want them to be super abundant, but we want them in a healthy ratio. And so if you look at a traditional GI map, you'll see a bar that has red, yellow, green, yellow, red. And that kind of gives that not too little, not too much kind of comparison, because when we're in the green, we're happy. We want them there. But if they're too low in one direction or the other, we have to address it. So in my case, I had low levels of one friendly bacteria, one commensal bacteria. Overall, though, everything else looked pretty good. So that was exciting to see. Now, there are bacterial phyla, and these are two families of bacteria. And we want those to be in a healthy ratio within each other. So Bacteroidetes and Firmicutes, without going too much into them, we want a healthy ratio between the two. And in my case, I did have a healthy balance. So one is what's considered gram-positive bacteria, and one is considered gram-negative, and they have to work symbiotically with us, and we want that balance. So we're looking at this as, okay, what can I do to bring that balance back into play if there is the opportunity? The healing opportunity is what we call it as FDNs, in order to do that. And we're looking at it throughout all of these kind of members of the microbiome. Then if we move right along, we look at the opportunistic bacteria. This is what we want to be sure there's not an overgrowth or an overabundance of, and this would further speak to dysbiosis. They produce pro-inflammatory liposaccharides, which increases inflammation and gut bacteria. And so when we're looking at these, we're looking at them similarly as we do the commensals. We're looking at, is there presence of them? Is there elevation of them? I had two that were considered high. And so going to be addressing this, and this is obviously, like I said before, being looked at in light of the fact that I do have intestinal permeability and GI inflammation, because it's all interconnected, because obviously our microbiome is influenced by those factors and vice versa. So different bacterium, we'll say, are associated with different types of symptoms, different susceptibilities. So in my case, like I said, I have two that are elevated. So addressing that through my protocol. And then there are, let's see, fungi and yeast. And these are typically always recommended, because when it comes to a GI map, it's suspected that it might not be showing the full picture of it, and that there might be a greater overgrowth than what is reflected. So that's super important that we are aware of that first and foremost, but we're also treating it. And when there's a disruption in our normal gut flora, when our commensals and, our bacteria overall is disrupted, this can make us more susceptible to overgrowths of some kind, of any kind. So that's important to consider. We want a strong, robust, healthy microbiome to do what it needs to do, and to keep everything moving and grooving. Like I said, there's that symbiotic relationship, but any imbalances there due to the number of influences that can cause imbalance, there can be more of an opportunity for bacteria growth, overgrowth, fill in the blank. So in my case, I had an overgrowth in Candida species, and so I will be treating this, because obviously we want to address each and every issue that might be present, but also looking at this in light of the fact that, there's leaky gut present, intestinal inflammation, and some dysbiosis existing there because of the fact that we have some elevations in certain bacteria, some lower levels, so there is an imbalance present. Then we look at viruses, and what's important to note here is that while they might show under detectable level, which, by the way, if you look at your GI map, it's going to say less than DL, and that's what that means, less than detectable level. It doesn't mean that they're not still present in the body. It's just that they are not actively shedding when we tested. So that's important to consider, that it's not to say that it's not present, but it's just not actively shedding, which it's important to make that distinction. Next, we look at parasites, and I had elevations in the Entamoeba coli. So with this, what's fascinating is these issues can go undetected for years and years and years, but it keeps the body in a low level, like prolonged state of chronic stress. So with the presence of these parasites, while they might not be causing outward dysfunction where we're very aware of their presence, they can still cause issues. And that's what's so valuable about the GI map, is because you're not going to know that there's something going on here that might be contributing to this dysfunction. So something to keep in mind, I will be following a parasite protocol alongside the Candida, alongside the H. pylori. So we had a little bit of everything. And what's interesting too, actually, I need to go back and look at my last test that I did. This was last spring. It wasn't a GI map. It was something called Tiny Health, which was, it's kind of like another, like an adjacent test that does a very similar thing. But I'm almost positive none of this was detected. So this must be like a recent development, because I don't remember seeing this on my last test. And the next category is worms, and I had none detected. Thank goodness. I heard the one FDN that is, she also works for FDN, but she's an FDN herself. She says, like, rarely do I ever see worms on a GI map. And I'm like, thank goodness, because that sounds dreadful. It sounds so miserable. Okay, so this is my favorite part of the GI map, I will not lie. We're looking at the intestinal health markers. So I'm going to run through them. I don't want to spend like a long time on these, because I'm sure you're already bored, but let's let's talk about the intestinal health markers. So, first and foremost, we have steatocrit, and steatocrit is a marker that looks at undigested fat in our stools. So, that is going to help us better understand how the body is digesting fat. Now, if you remember, we have a marker called indican that we looked at last episode, and that was telling us about protein. Now, while we don't have a marker necessarily that looks at carb digestion, we can get a good understanding of digestion by just understanding what is my steatocrit, what is my indican, and how can this better help me understand what is going on digestively. Not only that, the next marker, we have elastase. So steatocrit, elastase, and indican all give us information on digestion. And now we look at this in tandem with our GI map. We are unstoppable. Okay, we have such a wonderful understanding of what's going on. Is my body able to break down the food that I'm eating? You aren't what you eat, you are what you absorb. Remember that. So, keeping that in mind as you look at these numbers gives us clues as to, okay, so if I'm eating all the right things, but my body's not utilizing it or not, absorbing it, alongside understanding what does my mucosal barrier look like? Are the villi able to absorb the nutrition that I'm eating? Think about this. All of these markers coming together to really paint this beautiful picture. So it's pretty exciting. So steatocrit, like I said, measures our body's ability to digest fat, and elastase is an enzyme. Anything with an ASE at the end is an enzyme. So that's just a fun fact. When that's released by the pancreas, it demonstrates protein digestion, and the difference between indican and elastase, indican reflects the remainder of protein that wasn't digested, whereas this indicates the enzyme needed to break down protein. So there's a difference here. But this goes back to what I said before about having compromised stomach acid. Low stomach acid is incredibly common. Okay, I'll just put it out there. A lot of people think that it's, if I have acid reflux or, these issues, it must be because I have high stomach acid, but a lot of times it's a result of having low stomach acid. And then we have these antacids coming into our lives that we're told to take, or PPIs or things of that capacity, which just make matters incredibly more complex. I don't think that's the right sentence. More complex, we'll say. I love how you all just are like learning the English language alongside me with some things that I say here, because I do sometimes say things and I'm like, is that correct? Is that right? But what I was saying before is the pancreas relies on strong stomach acid to release these enzymes, these pancreatic enzymes. And so if H. pylori is present and that is neutralizing that stomach acid, or if we have low stomach acid for whatever reason, this then is not going to give the signal to the pancreas to release these enzymes, which is going to compromise digestion. Now, there can also be something called pancreatic insufficiency, which means that there's something wrong with the pancreas, and that's because it's not producing enzymes, but really, really interesting to see how these all connect. Next is beta-glucuronidase. Also, before I move on, beta-glucuronidase. Chronic stress can cause low stomach acid. And I think chronic stress is no stranger to 99% of people. So something to keep in mind. Because then we're looking at, well, what does my cortisol look like? What does the cortisol to DHEA ratio look like? Am I in a catabolic state, right? How is that impacting my stomach acid? Because what happens here is if we have a certain amount of a bank account, right? We call this the vital reserve in FDN. And if they are trying to prioritize where the money needs to go, money is often going to be shunted away from stomach acid, digestion, and put towards greater issues. So with that said, there's going to be a cost to our digestion, and we're going to see that manifest in low stomach acid, or just in some sort of compromise within digestion. So looking at the cortisol piece and understanding our hormones help to really flesh out this picture. Beta-glucuronidase is also ASE, so we have an enzyme, and it's geared towards digesting glucuronic acid, which is a large part of what a carbohydrate is. And when it's there in overabundance, it can have an impact. All right. So let's look at this through the lens of the liver. The liver is considered grand central station, super, super important. And when toxins come into the liver, they're going through what we call phase 1 detox and phase 2. Phase 1 is these toxins are put together into a concentrated form and they are made to be water soluble, because if they're not water soluble, they will not be excreted through our urine, and that's what we want. Phase 2, these toxins that are now in their highly concentrated form are bound to a binder and then neutralized, ready to be relinquished from the body. Okay, they're released from the liver into the urine and then out the door they go. However, beta-glucuronidase chews up the bond of the toxin and the binder. And the example that the one person who was explaining this gave is the liver's going around in this process of glucuronidation. That's not important for you to know, but I'll just share it. And tying everyone's shoes. Okay, so this is essentially the liver tying the toxin to a binder so that it's ready to rock to be left to be excreted from the body. The beta glucuronidase is going around behind the liver and untying all the shoes. Okay, so the beta glucuronidase is essentially allowing these toxins then to recirculate into the body because they're no longer being tied to that binder, and they're reactivated and they're circulating in the body in their highly concentrated form. So fascinating, because this shows a lot more about detox, but also beta glucuronidase increases with dysbiosis. So we can see how that might be a connection with beta glucuronidase and the gut. And elevated levels, I'll just share, are associated with overgrowth of opportunistic bacteria, liver congestion, compromised detox, estrogen dominance, which deserves a whole episode on its own. Actually, I had planned to do one, so I think I'll do one in the next couple weeks because this is super important, especially as it relates to testing and other intestinal symptoms, dysfunction within the body. So really interesting. I'll go through and share my results after I go through all of them. Occult blood. We do not want to find blood in our stool. If there's blood in the stool, that is something that we would refer out to a doctor. Then secretory IgA is a marker that we also looked at in our stool. I'm sorry, this is our stool. We looked at secretory IgA in our saliva. And Sig-A is essentially the bouncer at our mucosal barrier that's going to let someone into the club and then kick people out. So we want to see a strong level of Sig-A because that's determinant of immune function. So looking at it through our saliva, it might look differently than through our stool, and that's because it's coming from two different areas. So we have both of these to really show us what's going on through the immune lens. Then anti-gliadin. This marker is important to see if gluten is actively present in the body. People who are really, really actively gluten-free, they show low or undetectable levels. I think this can be a really good opportunity for people to understand, okay, even if you're trying to be gluten-free, it can be also hard to do that. And maybe you think you're living gluten-free, but you come to realize you're not, in fact, living gluten-free. So this is going to help us then better evaluate the mucosal immune response to gliadin, which is a component of gluten. So it's not so much about like, oh, celiacs or that sort of thing. It's more just about looking at the immune response to the presence of gluten. But we'll also look at this in relation to our secretory IgA. So it's all about the immune function and is it strong? Is it robust? Is it suppressed? Is it overactive? What's going on here? And how can we address it more comprehensively so that it's able to do what it is supposed to do, what it's meant to do? And then next is our calprotectin, and this is the most studied marker of GI inflammation. And it further contributes to our understanding of inflammation within the gut. So in my case, my steatocrit was beautiful, stunning, lovely, everything I could have ever dreamed of. My elastase, same thing. Your girl has strong enzymes here, okay? I'm very proud of them. My beta glucuronidase was also stunning, which I put a lot of work in my liver, so I would be very disappointed if I saw otherwise. Occult blood, not present. Secretory IgA it was in the green, actually. So the reference was 510 to 2010, and I was at 1430. My anti-gliadin was in the green. We want this low. Obviously, it was at 57, but we want less than 175. And then my calprotectin was under 173 at a 33. So overall, my intestinal health markers looked pretty strong. So quickly, the last test that I did not run on myself, but I'm planning to in the next couple weeks is the MRT food sensitivity screening. This is optional when it comes to the labs that we do as FDNs in training, but I decided to halt on that. I don't know why. Oh, because it was going to be an extra fee. So I was like, I'll just wait and I'll do it at a later date. So I think I'm going to do it in the next couple weeks because I'm going to get started. So I want to do it on myself. It's pretty straightforward, but it tests for 170 of the most commonly consumed foods and food chemicals and additives, which I think is really cool. And what makes this specific one preferred by FDN is it works with live blood. So you don't have to challenge the test with food, like eating the food for 2 weeks before you take the test. It's like a real time response that they can look at. The one person who was explaining it basically said, like, every test that comes in that day has to be done that day. So you could get like 1,000 tests one day and like they have to do them all because it's live blood. So I think it's really interesting. And what's valuable about understanding this, because I know that there are a ton of food sensitivity tests out there. I actually took one many years ago before I knew anything about testing, but I know there's so many, is it's low hanging fruit. So we can remove it today to put money back into our bank account now. And the goal is not to necessarily remove it forever and that's it. Because a lot of times these foods, like for the case study example, it's like sweet potatoes and I don't know, just random foods that are like technically healthy, that are whole, but your body's just reactive to them. So the goal is to remove them for the 90 days alongside sugar, alcohol, gluten, and so forth, and see how you feel, of course. But then also after the 90 days, start to reintroduce them and see how your body responds to them. So that is the point of this test, but it's really straightforward. It's really fascinating, and I'm excited to do it on myself to see even how it compares to the way it was, the one it was last time. And it's funny because even outside of just the foods, there's also food chemicals and additives that you can test for. And ideally, we would avoid most food additives and chemicals, right? So this kind of gives you further inspiration, but it's also important that you're looking at, are these additives in my like personal care products? One thing that I found to be astonishing is propylene glycol and sodium benzoate are two of my allergens actually that I learned I had for my skin, and they are present in food and then they're also in like moisturizer and like skincare. I did a presentation for the university before I was hired for them. This was like 2 years ago, 3 years ago. And I did a presentation on food for mental health. And I compared my Clinique moisturizer at the time and Ken's Russian dressing. And both of them had propylene glycol in it, I'm pretty sure, something like that. So something to keep in mind, I'm all about edible skincare. I am very much about that. I think that's like really cool when things you're putting on your skin you can actually eat and are safe, but this is not that. This is definitely not that. So I would not recommend. So that about sums up all of my results. I know that was a lot, especially this episode. This one was pretty dense, and I probably didn't even go in as much depth as I would like, but it is amazing what the marriage of all these results can show us as individuals. Because when you look at what I shared last episode and then what I shared this episode about the relationship amidst all of these markers, first and foremost, it's hard to wrap your head around, okay? Even as someone who's learning to practice this, it's a lot of information. I have another exam this week, and it's a lot of information to take in. But when you really understand the full picture, how amazing is it to know how your body is functioning? I mean, don't we all want to understand that? We all want to know, how is my body functioning? Because this is the predecessor to disease. This is the predecessor to the diagnosis. And we are not here to diagnose or treat disease. That is not the FDN way. The FDN way is to look at what is the chaos underneath the surface, the dysfunction in the gray area that we are not seeing, that is subclinical to what our healthcare profession can see? And how can we address that and look at those healing opportunities and really become those, like they call us, health detectives, to understand how they all interplay? What is the downstream impact of the dysfunction that's happening, a mile up the river, right? And how can we resolve it? Because so many of the symptoms that we see nowadays, whether it's painful cycles or digestive complaints or fatigue or, sensitivities or aches and pains and insomnia and restlessness and anxiety and irritability and all the things are rooted in these tests and can completely change someone's life as a result of it. So I hope that you are excited about this as I am. Like I said, this is essentially what a call would look like once we get all your results in, and much more obviously tailored to you. And we look at the documentation I mentioned. I think I mentioned in the first episode. There's 2 documents that you complete. The first one is a very detailed Excel sheet that goes through your symptoms and you score them. And then we can see some totals and we can kind of track that, use that as an opportunity to track, okay, how am I feeling? And then looking at 90 days, how things have resolved. And then the lifestyle medical history form is essentially you breaking down, this is how I eat, this is how I sleep, this is how I move, this is what my life's like, this is what my stress life is like. And then I take those 2 documents, I take all of the information that you've shared with me thus far, I take all of your test results, and I synthesize them like you wouldn't believe, okay? And I'm taking all of them in and I'm putting this picture together, and then we sit down and I get to deliver it to you and basically blow your mind, which is always the goal. And I think it's so cool. So just know that help is available. I will put the link for the scheduling page for consults there for you. If you're listening to this early June 23rd, consults will become available. So you can go ahead and schedule for that week. Rumor has it there will be a discount involved for someone who schedules for someone or for anyone who schedules that week. So if you're a current client of mine, you're already in for the discount. But also if you're not a client of mine and you like access to a discount, you can schedule that week, the 23rd to, I guess that's the 28th. Can I do math? Monday to Saturday? And is that right? I don't know if that math is right. You understand what I'm saying. Monday to Saturday. And that will be, you'll be eligible for a discount as a result of that. And then if you're listening to this episode, months later, it's not June anymore, or it's maybe next June, I'd love to work with you. So the link to get all the information is in the show notes. It'll direct you to my website, and you can also go on Instagram and find out more info there. But thanks so much for tuning in. I hope that this inspired you to maybe take this step in investing in your health, or maybe this sounds like something that would be helpful for you, or maybe you know someone. Please feel free to send them my way. I am so excited to watch how this transforms so many lives, and it feels so exciting to be the person who gets to guide individuals in this way. And so this is really exciting, and I cannot wait to dive in. So in the interim, I'm just recording podcast episodes of talking about it because that's as far as I can go right now. Give me a couple weeks and I'll be unstoppable. But for right now, I'll just share with you the exciting things that functional testing can do. So once again, thank you for tuning in. More to come on this in future episodes, more discussion around the value. And if you have requests for me or specific curiosities about how testing might be relevant for you, my email's in the show notes, so please feel free to reach out or shoot me a DM. But in the meantime, be well.